The heart of apologetics, this passage from 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, I know you guys are busy. I know you've had a lot going on. I know that it's been quite a year. But I would encourage you this week, read that verse a few times, try to memorize it. Because what you learn from Peter is that not only are we meant to do apologetics, which we'll talk about in just a second, but we're supposed to do it gently. We're supposed to be humble. The way we present the faith is meant to reflect the very heart of Jesus, who was gentle and lowly. One of the things that I'm going to help you see this week is that the message of the gospel never changes. The gospel we proclaim is a historic one. But the messengers of the gospel are always called to find new and creative ways to make that gospel intelligible and even beautiful to the peoples that they're bringing it to. Lamin Sanneh says that translation, and he's talking about Bible translation, actually bringing sacred scripture from one language into another, is the church's missionary benchmark as well as its birthmark. I love that phrase. The goal of the church is to make the gospel intelligible to the people that are hearing it. But what's interesting is, as Lamin Sanneh was writing, he was thinking about Bible translation. But for all of us, we should actually be thinking about that every day. How is the gospel unintelligible to a city like Addis? And how do you find creative ways to make it clear and beautiful and compelling? It might not mean speaking a different language, but it's going to mean figuring out the questions that people are asking. It's going to mean using images and illustrations that people can resonate with. And as you'll see, it means embodying a community that lives out these truths. These are some of the ideas, not all, but some of the main ideas that we're going to be unpacking this week, and I'm really excited about our time together. If you go to page 2 of the handout, I have some more introduction proper kinds of things that I want to walk with you through. The first is our goals, so what I hope to accomplish when I get on the plane on Thursday night. If these things are true, I'll feel like I have succeeded. 1, I want you to become convinced that apologetics and cultural engagement should undergird every part of your ministry. 2nd, I want you to gain tools for how you can understand and engage with the culture or the cultures that are present in your ministry context. Some of you I know will stay or want to stay in Addis. Others of you will go to other parts of Ethiopia, maybe other parts of the world. I want you to be able to understand, how do we engage with the cultures that are present in our ministry context? And then 3rd, I want to help you, because at some level, all of you are going to lead people, other Christians. I want to help you equip those people to be public with their faith so that they themselves engage culture as disciples of Jesus. And all of this matters because of evangelism. I went to a seminary, my first seminary, that was very much into apologetics. And I loved it and I learned a lot from it. But what I realized after a few years studying there is that it's really possible to become really excited and really good at defending the faith while you never actually talk to anybody about the faith. You read all the books, you know all the arguments, but you haven't really brought anybody to Christ. You haven't sat down with someone who doesn't identify as a Christian and taken time to listen to them and help them see how Jesus could be the better answer for their soul's longings. So I'm interested in evangelism, not just giving you information to make you smart. I'm interested in helping us together become more equipped to make the gospel known and real to people all around you. And that's why we're doing this. Do you know the story in 2 Kings chapter 7? The Israelite people were being besieged by a neighboring army, and there were a couple of lepers. These were the outcasts, the people who were marginalized in their society. And they were stuck because they weren't allowed in the camp of Israel, right? You remember, if you were diseased with leprosy, you can't go into the camp. But they also couldn't go to the neighboring army because they would have been captured and killed. So one day, these Israelites, these lepers, say to themselves, look, if we stay here, we're going to die. We have no food. If we go back to Israel, they're not going to let us in and they have no food. Why don't we just go and give ourselves to the enemy? Maybe they'll show mercy to us, give us some food, and help us make it through today. So these guys wander over to the camp of the enemy, and when they get there, they find that the whole place is empty. Instead, the only thing that's left is food and drink and resources. So here's 4 lepers in the entire camp of the enemy eating and feasting and drinking and thanking God for their meal and their good fortune. And then they say to themselves in verse 9 of chapter 7, what we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news. Or in the Greek version of the Old Testament, this is a day of gospel. And we're keeping it to ourselves. It's never right for Christians who have good news to keep that to themselves. And so what we're doing this week, like those lepers realized all those years ago, is it's not good, it's not right to not share the message of Jesus. But we want to do so in ways that people can relate to. Now, as we go through the week, there's going to be 4, you might say, themes or ideas or aspects of culture that we're going to pay a special attention to. Part of this was my conversations with Josh, knowing this context well, and one I've added. We're going to be looking at what is the prosperity gospel, how does that impact the way the faith is made known. We'll talk a little bit about Islam. We'll talk a little about deconstruction or agnosticism. And we'll talk also about secularism. As Josh mentioned, secularism, when I did my Doctor of Ministry work, that's what I focused on. And so we'll talk a lot about what is secularism and how do you, as people engage in the culture, think about it. I'm kind of curious to learn from you how present secularism is. I think Issachar was saying it's pretty much here, but if it's not here yet, it's coming. And so we're going to spend some time this week talking about that. You notice in the handout I say we're going to be learning together through all of this, because I've come here not just as someone to teach, I've come here as someone to learn. I believe that when you live and minister in a big city, that you can always learn something from other people who live in big cities, because we actually have more in common than we do dissimilar. So London is more like Addis than London is like other parts of the UK, because the values and the impulses of a big city, the things that draw people here, they're the same the world over. So we're going to learn together this week. So look with me. What I want you guys to see, if I could make one contribution to you this week, I think this would be it. It's to see apologetics as not a program in your church or something you do once a week on some weeknight for non-Christians, but to actually begin to understand that apologetics is a posture, not a program, it's a posture that should undergird every single part of your pastoral ministry. The kids' ministry in the church should have apologetics. Your preaching should have apologetics. Your pastoral counseling should have apologetics. There should be nothing you do that doesn't have apologetics in it. And here's why. 2 reasons. Because we live in a secular world and because everybody needs the gospel. For those 2 reasons, apologetics should pervade everything you do. So let's spend some time now and unpack what we mean by our secular world. Have you guys heard of Charles Taylor? So he's a Canadian, just because you brought that up. Canadian philosopher, and he wrote a big, huge book, 20 years ago, called A Secular Age. It's a very academic book, super difficult to read. But thankfully, because it's so important, a lot of other people who are smarter than me have read the book and have written books about the book. You know your book is tough to understand when people have to write books about your book. But that's what people have done. Charles Taylor's main contribution is that the world we live in right now, and I'm curious, we can talk about this, but I would guess that Addis, if it's not already there, is on its way there, is secular, but not necessarily in the way you might think. So Charles Taylor, in his book, gives 3 definitions of secular. So this is middle of page 3. Let's spend some time and unpack what he means. Secular 1, let's call it, the first way the word secular was ever used was to distinguish sacred and secular vocations. You guys do Reformation church history, right? So you know that in the Reformation, part of what had happened in the Catholic Church was a sharp distinction between the sacred and the secular. So the priests do sacred work, work that is spiritual, work that is holy, and everyone else does secular work which is work that isn't spiritual, work that isn't holy, work that isn't connected to the church. So the first way the word secular was ever used was to distinguish between sacred vocation and secular vocation. It was to say nothing about whether or not people believed in God or whether or not people went to church, not at all. It was just to say, if you're a baker, that's a secular job. If you're a priest, that's a sacred job. You with me? Fast forward to the Enlightenment. And now we start to see the emergence of a new word called secularism, or what Charles Taylor calls secular too. And what secular too was all about was saying, as society becomes more modern, more technological, more scientific, we're going to move away from the supernatural. We're not going to need a God in the heavens because we're going to be able to figure everything out on our own. So secularism was the attempt to divorce God from public life. It was to say we don't need God to have law and order. We don't need God to have medicine. We don't need God to have education. So secularism was an attempt within society to separate faith and life or civility. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what's interesting is that the secularism, was for many sociologists, writing in the 1950s, 1970s, they were predicting the way of the future is a secular world, and by that they meant secular too. They meant that we were going to inhabit a world in which people might have private faith, but we're no longer going to need religion for the public sector. We're no longer going to need, because religion is faith, it's mythical, it's a crutch for weak people. We're not going to need it in the future. What's interesting is that now sociologists look back and say the secularization thesis was completely misguided. That as the world becomes more technological, actually faith is on the rise. So I'll give you an example. Do you know which city in Europe is most quickly becoming less secular in the definition of secular too? Anybody want to take a guess? Huh? Not New York. Europe. In Western Europe. London. Since 1980, the percentage of people who identify as religious is going up compared with the number of people coming into the city. We're becoming a more religious city, not a more secular one. So the point there is that secular too, as is defined by Charles Taylor and others, is not really holding true. It's present. The impact of it is very much part of our world, but it isn't the case that as people get more scientific or technological, that they lose their longing for God. Now, if you go back to the very beginning, that's what Rebecca Manley-Pippert is talking about. That just because the world is secular doesn't mean people are losing their desire for God or for faith. So here's what's super interesting. It's a great question because you're saying actually people are more scientific, they're more technological, they're more interconnected. It does seem like faith is going down. But here's really what's going down. And if you want to look this up, write down the name Grace Davies. She used to teach at the University of Exeter in the UK. And here's what she concluded researching secularism, that what's going down is inherited religion, but not religion as a whole. What she means is in the old world, you were whatever your parents were. So if your parents are Roman Catholic, you're a Roman Catholic, and you dare not question it. If your family is Orthodox, you're Orthodox, and you dare not question it. What Grace Davies says is with the rise of secularism, young people especially are given more options, and they're moving away from the faith of their families. They're moving away from traditionalist structures, but they're not necessarily moving away from faith altogether. So oftentimes you have people moving from one religion to the next, or what you have is people saying, I'm spiritual but not religious. I have a longing for God, I want to have some kind of connection to the divine, but I'm not really into institutionalized religion. And friends, those are the people that are ripe for evangelism, by the way. Super ripe. So does that make sense? That's Grace Davies' theory, but I'm seeing it play out, at least in London. Again, I'm new here, so I'm not saying that this is exactly what's happening in Addis, maybe. I want to learn with you. But what she's saying, what I think is right, is secularization didn't remove people's need for God, but what it did do was start to dismantle institutionalized religion that people accept blindly. That's what really started to get torn down. Is that happening here? Do you see that? It is, okay. So that's the impact of secularization. But we're not even at secular 3. And this is the one that's most important, I think, for you guys as people who are going to pastor. This is the most complicated one, but once you get it, I think the light bulbs will go on and you'll say, this makes perfect sense. Secular 3 is a way of talking about a secular world in which multiple and competing beliefs are plausible. Okay, secular 3 is to imagine a world in which multiple and competing beliefs are plausible. This is another way to talk about pluralism. I'll give you this example. In the 1500s, if you were to go outside and say to someone random that you've never met before, I believe in God. Charles Taylor says that's the equivalent of walking outside today and looking at a tree and saying, I believe that that's a tree. Someone would say, of course that's a tree. Now everybody knows that's a tree. Charles Taylor says in the 1500s, if you said that about God, everyone would say, of course there's a God. We couldn't even imagine, we couldn't even begin to convene a world in which there isn't a God. But now, Charles Taylor says, we live in a world in which multiple and competing beliefs about God, about humanity, about good and evil, about all the most basic things, multiple and competing beliefs are held. And what that means is all beliefs are now contested. Or another way to say it is believers have doubts and sometimes doubters believe. There's this great novel by an American author called Julian Barnes. He's writing a book about coming to grips with death, with mortality. And the very first line of that novel is, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. That's a perfect summary of secular 3. I don't believe in God, but sometimes I wish he was out there. I believe in God, but sometimes I doubt my beliefs, and I don't know that I can trust them. Secular 3 is a world in which all beliefs are contested, which means, and come back with me to the quote, a society is secular insofar as religious belief or belief in God is understood to be one option among others, and thus contestable and contested. So at issue here is a shift in the conditions of belief. What makes something believable? Here's why I think this matters profoundly. If this is true, and I have personal experience, not just academic research experience, but personal experience to say, I pastor in a city that's filled with secular 3. People who are all the time batted around between all kinds of plausible belief systems, systems of belief in society that seem to make sense. If that's true, that means that Christians and non-Christians together are inhabiting the secular world. And therefore, as a pastor, your job is to do apologetics to both of them. Because it's not just non-believers who have doubts about Christian faith. Oftentimes, the Christians in your churches will too. Let me show you. As people living in a globalized world, and especially young people, and especially in urban centers, we now inhabit a world in which non-belief and the divine is plausible and also preferable to many. So even committed Christians will experience doubts about their most basic beliefs. Have you ever seen a Christian friend start to doubt? Maybe they say something like, I've been praying and I've cried out to God for years about this specific issue, and God never answered my prayer. Maybe he's not out there. Like that happens. That would have never happened 500 years ago. If God doesn't answer your prayer, it's because he didn't want to. But now people begin to doubt their faith, oftentimes because of life experiences. And the resulting condition, when that happens, is what Charles Taylor calls cross pressure. Okay, let me read. The simultaneous pressure of various spiritual options, the feeling of being caught between an echo of transcendence, there must be a God, and the drive towards immanentization. I think he made that word up. But what it means is, as a person, you feel a tension every day between a longing for the divine, a belief that there's something beyond the walls of this world, and a deep-seated pull to live for the here and now. That's where people are, if this is true, if we live in a secular age. If it is, we need a renewed approach to apologetics, which understands that apologetics is not something you do just for non-Christians, because the Christians in your churches are feeling this cross pressure. Believers doubt and doubters believe. So our approach to apologetics must start by engaging with the doubts and the questions that both Christians and non-Christians have. So you might say that in our secular world, apologetics, many of you use the word defending the faith. I actually like the word commending the faith. And the reason is because sometimes you need to commend the faith to people who already believe it, but they are struggling. Your job is to do apologetics for them. It's to help them see the truthfulness and the beauty and the relevance of the Christian faith for all their life. Yeah, for non-Christians, there is a longing to be part of something spiritual. There's a longing to be part of something communal, to be part of a family. These impulses are there. They're very much there. If you remember, I said there's two reasons why apologetics should undergird every part of your ministry. So the first is my conviction: we live in a secular world, and therefore Christians and non-Christians need the gospel. They need to hear about Jesus. They need to have the faith represented to them. And therefore, your job as a pastor is to help people follow Jesus, so we're doing that for everybody. But there's a second reason, and that has to do with the nature of the gospel itself. The nature of the gospel itself. I don't think that anything I'm about to say is going to be novel to you. If it is at this point in your year, there's just no way, so I know it's not. But anyway, what I want to do is give you an apologetic lens or an apologetic angle on the nature of the gospel. So read with me Galatians 2, verse 16. The Apostle Paul says, "We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ." That's a statement of the gospel, right? This is how you become right with God, because of the finished work of Jesus on the cross. You can't add to it, can't complete it. Jesus says it's finished, and it is. You know that. To unpack that just a little bit more, Paul says, or the New Testament says, the gospel is news. It's something about an event that happens in history, Christ's life, his death, his resurrection. The gospel is also victory in that on the cross, Jesus actually defeats evil powers. He defeats sin and death and the devil. He promises to bring a healed world into existence. And the gospel's power. The gospel creates new life and new family and a new ethic. So that's what the gospel is: news, victory, power. You're saying, I know all that. Here's what's interesting. The book of Galatians is probably the clearest exposition of the gospel in the New Testament. Paul in Galatians is trying to help the Galatians understand the gospel. But the Galatians already believe it. The Galatians are already Christians. The Galatians already go to church. And what Paul's doing in Galatians is he's saying to Christians, you think you believe the gospel, but you really don't. You think you understand the gospel, but you really haven't got it fully. Because even though you come to church and even though you say that you believe, what you're doing is looking to circumcision as the thing you need to complete your spiritual experience. So Paul says in Galatians 3, verse 2 and 3, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" What Paul's saying simply is this: you identify as Christians, but you're missing the force of the gospel. Because the gospel is not just how somebody becomes a Christian. The gospel is for the entirety of the Christian's life. The gospel isn't the way you get into Christianity. The gospel is the fuel for every part of Christianity. And that means Christians need the gospel. Very mature believers in Jesus need the gospel every single day. And if your job as a pastor is to give people the gospel, and those people live in a secular world, then you have to do apologetics. Because apologetics is about making the gospel accessible to people who live in a world in which multiple beliefs are contested and contestable. So you're never not doing apologetics if your job as a pastor is to help people live in the fullness of the gospel for the entirety of their Christian life. Everyone needs apologetics. Everyone needs you to help them understand the beauty and the compelling truth of the Christian faith. So to reiterate, we should see every aspect of our work as pastors and church leaders as apologetic, helping people understand and then apply the whole gospel to their whole lives. That's your whole job. And you can't do that without apologetics, because we live in a contested world, a world in which multiple beliefs are plausible, and doubters believe and believers have doubts. Questions? Comments? If you use the secular to definition, so here's what's really interesting. In the first century, when the New Testament is being written, the world was incredibly pluralistic. You guys know, for example, that in the ancient Roman world, whenever you went to a new town, so like let's say, okay, so I'm from London. So if I'm an ancient Roman, London has a god. So I pray to my god, my London god. But when I come to Addis, Addis has a god too. So I don't want to offend you guys, and I don't want to offend the god of Addis. So when I'm in Addis, I pray to the god of Addis, right? And then when I go over to Frankfurt, I do the same thing. Because every town has a god, every guild, every trade union has a god. And so it's pluralistic in the sense that there are many gods. Now, it wasn't secular in the sense that there were almost no people who didn't believe in the gods. So secular too is new. It's a post-Enlightenment thing, because what secular too did was it said we don't need the divine anymore. We don't need supernatural. We have everything we need in the immanent frame within the walls of this world. That's new. That's post-Enlightenment. What's interesting is that in the first century, when the Christians came along, do you know what the Romans called Christians? It was a derogatory term. It was meant to shame them. They were called atheists because they didn't accept all the gods. The Christians were the first people to be called atheists because they said no to all the gods. They said there's only one. And the Christians were seen as being anti-God. So I would say the situation in the first century was pluralistic, much like our society is, but it wasn't secular in the way our society is, because almost nobody had a disbelief in the divine, which is very true today. And to disbelieve in the divine, as Christians were thought to have done, was actually very repugnant to ancient society. So I don't think it's new for our age only, but I don't think it was at the time of the apostles, secular too. Okay, so we're on page 4, and what I want to do now is just say a few more things about why apologetics matters. If you are following the train of thought so far, we started by saying this is what apologetics is, and then we talked about how apologetics should be part of every aspect of your ministry because we live in a secular world and because we love the gospel and we want the gospel to be made known because that's what every person needs, regardless of whether or not they're a Christian or not. They need the gospel. What I want to do now is just give you a few more ideas about why you should do apologetics. The first and the most important in terms of obedience is the Bible tells us to. So the Bible itself in 1 Peter 3, this great text, gives us a command to be ready to make a defense. And as you know, that Greek word make a defense is apologion, which, as you see here in the handout, in noun and verb form, there are 18 uses in the New Testament. And there's a very limited lexical range. You can make a defense formally, meaning you give a presentation. You can make a defense informally, sitting over coffee. You can do so in written form, which might be a book or a blog or a tweet, and it can be spoken in conversation or in a sermon. But you should know that throughout the New Testament, even though it's not always translated make a defense, the word appears about 20 times. So it's very much a significant part of what it means to be a proclaimer of the gospel, this idea of an apologion or an apologetic. Come back with me, though, to 1 Peter chapter 3. Let me read this verse because we want to unpack this text, right? We want to root everything we believe, everything we do in Scripture. So let's come back to 1 Peter 3. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Do it with gentleness and respect. Peter is writing to a context that's not that dissimilar from our own. It's a context in which people believe and some people are hostile to the Christian faith. Therefore, this call to apologetics is as relevant today as it has ever been. It's the same kind of situation, not exactly, but similar, that Peter was initially giving guidance to Christians in. Notice what Peter says you have to be ready to give a reason for. It's the hope that is in you. I think that's really interesting. Because if you were to ask Peter, well, what does that mean? What is the hope? I think you can actually make a case that Christian hope is the entirety of God's salvific work in and through Christ for his people in the world. In other words, to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is in you doesn't just mean you know one tiny part of the Christian faith, but it means you're able to speak to somebody about any aspect of the Christian faith in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that's relevant to them. Peter says you're to do all of that with gentleness and respect. Now that word gentleness, we'll come back to that in just a little bit, but I want to focus for the moment on that word respect. The Greek word is phobos. You guys are Greek experts, right? What's that mean? Fear. So Peter says, make a defense with gentleness and fear. What's he talking about? Well, commentators debate, but it seems like Peter is saying something like this. At best, when you give your apologetic remarks, you need to do so very respectful of the people who are in front of you, honoring them. You shouldn't be flippant. You shouldn't be dismissive. You shouldn't be condescending. I'll give you an example. When I was young in my ministry, very young, when I would preach, sometimes I would do a kind of dialogue, like I would assume the voice of someone that I was talking to. So I'm preaching, and then I would say, have you ever heard someone say to you? And then I would assume a kind of other voice. And whenever I was representing a person who didn't believe or who didn't identify as a Christian, the voice that I assumed was always kind of silly. I don't know. It was a little youthful. It was a little immature. And a friend of mine, and you got to thank God for friends like this, said, hey, Bijan, I just want to give you some feedback. Whenever you assume the voice of the non-Christian, you always sound like you're being a little disrespectful. And I said, oh my gosh, thank you for pointing that out. And I don't think I've ever done that since. But what I learned is that in my heart, no, this is many years ago, but in my heart, I kind of had a superiority complex where I thought, because I know the truth, I'm inferior, or I'm superior to the people around me who don't know the truth. Do you see Peter saying, that is awful if you're like that. That is awful if you have that attitude. So when you speak about the gospel to other people, you want to have a tone of reverence and respect for them. But I don't think that's Peter's main point. I think Peter's talking about the fear of God. The reverence or the respect that you need to have, the phobos you need is the fear of the Lord, which is every time you have a chance to share the gospel with somebody, God is looking over your shoulder. Are you sharing that gospel truthfully, boldly, courageously, and lovingly in the fear of God? That's what I think Peter is really getting at. Another reason, not only because do we do apologetics because the Bible says so, but because you love Jesus. Because you absolutely love Jesus. Have you ever had an incredible meal and your instinct after having that incredible meal is to do what? To tell somebody. You know how many pictures of food there are on Instagram? I mean, it's crazy. People, when they have a beautiful experience, they want to share it with somebody else. Christians are the most effective in their apologetics when they love Jesus through the sky and they've tasted his beauty. Because what happens when you've tasted the beauty of God, you can't help but want to share and show that beauty with others. So we do apologetics because we love Jesus, because we want others to experience him. And look at this great quote from Dan Strange. We're going to talk about him a lot this week. Dan Strange says, to put it another way and a little flippantly, we want to help people meet VIP Jesus, but there are these big scary bouncers who get in the way. So if you want to get into a nightclub, right, there's bouncers who guard the door and you can't get in unless you have access or you know somebody. So what Dan Strange is saying is we want people to meet Jesus, the big VIP, but there's all these blockers, these bouncers that keep people from knowing him. They have their bald heads and their neck tattoos. Nothing wrong with being bald, by the way. Until we can get past them, introductions to Jesus can't be made. Precisely what these bouncers are depend upon a person's culture. Now, we're going to talk a lot about culture in the coming days. But do you see what he's saying? Why do you do apologetics? Because Jesus is the most spectacular, beautiful, glorious, wonderful person who's ever existed. And you're not going to be able to introduce people to that glorious, spectacular person unless you deal with the bouncers at the door. The things that make belief implausible and difficult. Why do you do apologetics? Because the Bible tells you to, because you love Jesus, and also because you love the people around you. If you're not motivated by a genuine love for someone, you're not going to tell them about Jesus. Love is the fundamental motivator, because the most loving thing you can do for another human being is help them get closer to God through Jesus. That's the most loving thing you can do for anyone. And I guess this is fourth. Why do you do apologetics? Because the gospel is good news. Let me unpack this for a few minutes. The gospel is not advice about what you should do. The gospel is news about what God has done for you and who God is. Tom Wright puts it this way: history is what matters. This is why Luke, one of the gospel writers, intends to write about actual events that have taken place in the actual past. Anyone who writes like this is intending to describe historical events. The story that Luke tells, therefore, only means anything if it takes place within public world history. You guys know this, but what Tom Wright's saying, very simply, if Christianity is just an inspirational tale, it isn't. It isn't anything unless it's news, unless it's history. And the way the gospel writers proclaim and tell about what Jesus has done is to say, at such and such a time, in such and such a place, this happened. Now, why does that matter? Because if the Bible isn't true historically, then at best it's just advice. Look at these inspirational tales, go and try to follow their example. But if the Bible is news, if the Bible is about what God has done in time and space for his people, the only way you can share news is with words. You have to use your mouth, you have to use sentences, you have to use vocabulary to proclaim news about what God has done. So for example, in ancient times, before they had technology to communicate, if you wanted to communicate with your army, let's say the king was off leading his people to battle, if the battle was not successful, the king would send a messenger back to the city. And the king would say to the messenger, you need to run back to the city, and you would need to tell the people what they need to do in order to stand against the army that's coming to get them. In other words, the king would send advisors, and the advisors would give advice about what you have to do to survive. But if the victory was successful, if the king leading the army out to battle had the victory, if they defeated the enemy, then the king would send back not advisors, the king would send a herald. And the herald would say, gospel, good news. Our king was victorious, the battle is won, we are safe, and we're at peace. The gospel is all about being a herald, not an advisor. Advisors say, this is what you have to go and do. Heralds say, this is what has been done for you. This is why, by the way, I know it's English, but the Christmas song, we don't say, hark the heavenly advisor angels sing. We say, hark the herald angels sing, because we proclaim news about what God has done. The only way to share news is with words. We share our faith because we believe the gospel is good news for the whole world. Let me give you one other reason why you should do apologetics. Can you turn to Acts chapter 10? It's one of my favorite stories about apologetics. It's great. I promise you, unless you've read the book that I got this from, you probably haven't thought about apologetics like this. Can somebody read the first 8 verses of Acts chapter 10? So here's what's interesting about this story. Think with me. This is an apologetic story, isn't it? Cornelius, the text tells us, is a God-fearer, meaning he's someone who has an inclination to the spiritual, but he's not a believer in Jesus. He's very powerful. He's very successful. He's like a professional businessman in Addis who has an inclination to the divine. That's what Cornelius, upstanding, moral, wants to know God, doesn't know God in Jesus. He needs the gospel, right? He needs apologetics. He needs someone to come along and make the gospel known to him. So notice what happens. One day he has a vision. An angel comes to him, and what is the angel? So here's this man who wants to know God, who wants to know Jesus. And an angel who knows God really well shows up. And what does the angel say to him? God is hearing your prayer. And then what does he tell Cornelius to do?
To bring Simon Peter.
Get Peter. Friends, do you know how strange that is? The angels know the gospel better than you and I do. The angels are the ones who live in the very presence of God all the time. Why didn't the angel just tell Cornelius the gospel? The angel's there. Why doesn't the angel just say, Cornelius, you want to know the gospel? I know it really well. Let me tell it to you. And Cornelius would say, that's the best sermon I've ever heard. And he would believe, just like he does when Peter comes. Why doesn't the angel just tell Cornelius the gospel? And the answer is because God has ordained that other people would share the gospel with other people. That's how God does it. God, in his wondrous grace, has chosen to use imperfect, weak, broken messengers like you and I to be the people who share the gospel. And as I'm going to show you later this week, partly that's because of what the gospel is. Peter and Cornelius needed to get in the same room together because until they did, they both had a deficient understanding of the gospel. But that's for a later day. All I want you to see at this point is God is perfectly capable of sounding from the sky the gospel to the whole world. But in his mysterious providence, he said instead, I want to use you guys to make the gospel known in this city. That's an amazing thing, that you are God's choice to make the gospel known more than the angels themselves. That's why you should do apologetics, because the Bible tells us to, because we love Jesus, we love the people around us. The gospel is news, and God's grace is wonderful. But what we want to do now is start laying some apologetic foundations. So what I think I'm going to do here is walk you through this section, and then we're going to do some group exercise, okay? So what we want to talk about now is the methods of apologetics. Have you ever heard of apologetic methods? Anyone? What do we mean by that?
Yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. What are the approaches or the starting points that people have? So what we want to do now is talk about methods for a few minutes. But let me just say right off the bat, my conviction is that there's no method that's better or more right than another. I think there are some that are more foundational, but I think all of the methods should work together in tandem to round out a comprehensive and a healthy apologetic. I should also say that everything in this section is simply summarized from a book that's there in your footnotes. It's called Apologetics at the Cross by Jonathan Chatraw and Mark Allen. So if you're interested in learning more about these various methods. But what I want to do now is walk you through them, and then what we'll do is we'll have an exercise practicing, sort of using these methods in a real life situation. I'll say off the bat that this section of our discussion might feel a little abstract or academic, but as I hope to show you eventually, we can benefit from every one of these methods or approaches. I also want to start by reading Francis Schaeffer, who says, if we're really personal as created by God, then every individual will differ from everyone else, and therefore, each person must be dealt with as an individual, not as a case or a statistic or a machine. No set formula meets everyone's needs, if only applied as a mechanic formula. I doubt it really meets anyone's need, short of an act of God's mercy. So that's the attitude, right? We're going to talk about the methods, but what we want to pay attention to is not which method is the best, but how do we learn from the best of all these methods to have a comprehensive and really healthy approach to apologetics. Make sense? So let's go through them. Method one is sometimes called the classical or the two-step approach to apologetics. So here's what it means. If you're talking to someone who isn't a Christian, the first thing that you want to do is show them that there must be a God. And then once you've convinced them that there is a God, you then show them why the Christian God is the most compelling, beautiful, factual, trustworthy of all the possible gods there could be. So you see the two steps? Step one, believe in a God. Step two, believe in Jesus as that God, or the God of the Bible as that God. Can you think of any popular books that are sort of the two-step approach, the classical approach to apologetics? One of the most popular apologetic books in world history is a two-stepper. Mere Christianity. That's what Lewis does. Do you know the book, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity? Two-step. Starts, let me convince you that there's a God, and then let me show you why the Christian God is the most intelligible, beautiful of all the possible gods that are out there. That's why Lewis, in the book, he basically becomes a theist, he says, because of the argument from evil. That's a classical approach to apologetics. So the argument from evil is simply this. Lewis says, the presence of evil in the world bothers me. But if there isn't a God, then why would evil bother me? It's just the way things are. It's the strong eating the weak, and I should like it. But I don't. Something about the presence of evil makes me angry. It makes me upset. It makes me feel like there is a standard to which people must be held. But if I don't believe in God, then where does that standard come from? It can't come from any human society because every human society is different. So for Lewis, the very presence of evil in the world was for him the nudge he needs to become a theist. And now he says, once I believe that there is a God, I can go from there and say, why is the Christian God the most trustworthy and beautiful of all the possible gods that are out there? You with me? Classical apologetics. Very good. I love that book. And there's other classical arguments. I put these two together because they're very similar. But the next one is what you might call evidential apologetics. Evidentialists do apologetics just by believing if they present the most compelling arrangement of facts, people will believe. So how do you know Jesus rose from the dead? Boom, here's 10 reasons. How can you trust the Bible? Boom, here's 10 reasons. Archaeology, literary documents, whatever, the prophecy fulfilled. Here's how you can trust the Bible. So classical apologetics, two-step, 1 and 2. Let's argue for God. Let's get to Jesus second. Evidential, doesn't matter where we start. Virgin birth, authority of the Bible, resurrection. Give the most compelling answers or arguments for those questions, those issues, and people are going to believe. What's a really popular, you may not know this one, but a really popular evidentialist approach to apologetics book? Case for Christ. Case for Christ, Lee Strobel. Boom, he's a lawyer, right? I'm going to make my argument. We're going to go evidence by evidence, and we're going to believe in Jesus. Very helpful book, compelling in a lot of ways. There are some dangers with these two methods, though. The first is that they can view humans as primarily thinking beings and focus on arguments that appeal cerebrally. If I just give people the right information, they'll believe, as if humans are brains on sticks, which they're not. And sometimes people can have really compelling arguments and not listen to them. This is the same reason why, even though you know eating too much ice cream isn't good for you, you still want to do it. At least I do. Why? Because I like it. I know that too much ice cream, especially now as a middle-aged man, is not good for me. But it's good, so I want to eat it. Right? So in other words, just appealing to rationality doesn't always work. Second, evidence-based approaches can lack an appreciation for human situatedness. So someone says to you, as an example, I'm really struggling believing in the resurrection. And what you do is you say, well, let's have coffee. And in the week leading up to your coffee, you go and you read all the best books on the resurrection, and you come and you sit with them and you say, I know you're struggling with the resurrection, so here's 15 reasons historically why the resurrection is trustworthy. But if you would have stopped and listened, you would have known that the reason why the person is struggling with the resurrection is actually because their parent was just diagnosed with a fatal disease, and they're going to die. And they're heartbroken. And they don't know how to process the claims of the Christian faith with the idea that their parent, who isn't a believer, is about to die. In other words, you can have all the right arguments or evidences, but if you're not paying attention to the person, you're not really answering their question. So those are some of the weaknesses of those approaches. Make sense? Okay. Next, presuppositional apologetics. You guys read a little about this, I think, or you should have in your readings leading up to the class. Presuppositionalism is probably the one that I've been most shaped by, and even still, it's the hardest for me to explain. It is so confusing when people talk about presuppositional apologetics. So let me do my best. Presuppositional apologetics is the idea that nobody argues from neutrality, but everyone has a set of beliefs or here's a better way to say it. Everyone looks at the world through a set of glasses, and the color of the lenses on those glasses impacts everything. So if I wear red-colored glasses and I look at the world, what color is everything going to look? Red. Presuppositionalism says everybody has a worldview or some kind of lens that's covering their view of things, and until you unmask and uncover what those presuppositions are, you can't really do apologetics. You can't really have a conversation with someone until you unearth and uncover those starting points. So for example, you might be saying, the resurrection is true, the resurrection is true, the resurrection is true, but if someone's worldview says supernatural things are not possible, then you're going to be having a conversation almost in two different languages. So Cornelius Van Til, John Frame, others are proponents of this. It's hard to think of a book that's very popular in the presuppositional lane. Tim Keller's Reason for God, maybe, but it's actually more of a Method 4 book, which we'll get to in just a second. Well, he actually does all of it in his book, but that's beside the point. Give you an example of presuppositional apologetics. Sometimes you have modern people who are progressive or liberal, if those terms are used here, people who believe in equality, human rights, etc. And they'll say, I believe in human rights, I believe in human dignity, everybody should be treated fairly and equally. Men and women, everything should be equal. And the question for that person should be, why? If there isn't a God, why is it that every human being should be treated equally? From what reason? We don't get that from nature. I mean, nature is pretty brutal. Like, my daughter's really into lions right now, and for some reason, lions eating antelope doesn't freak her out. So we watch them on National Geographic sometimes. But I'm not a terrible dad, I promise. She just likes it. But what's the point? that's the strong eating the weak. Nature does not give us a vision or values for human rights. So if someone says, I want to believe in human rights, but I don't believe in God, what you want to do as this is presuppositional apologetics, is you want to uncover, actually, you have a tremendous amount of, you have starting points or assumptions there that need to be uncovered and exposed. And we can show you how actually those beliefs only make sense in the context of a God who gave human beings dignity and value and worth. And so you go from that assumption or that presupposition into the Christian faith. The dangers of this method is they're very much exposed to circular reasoning. If I say to someone, you have assumptions and a starting point, what are they going to say to me? So do you. So you know what Van Til used to say? When people would say, oh, this is circular, Cornelius Van Til was a professor at Westminster Seminary. This is back in the middle part of the 20th century, and he's credited with sort of being the father of presuppositional apologetics, although he would have hated that. He would have said it's in Paul, but whatever. When a student asked Van Til, well, Dr. Van Til, you're just doing circular reasoning yourself. Van Til says, I know, but mine's the right circle. So his point was, I'm just going to be unashamed about the fact that as a Christian, I believe in divine revelation, and that's my starting point. I believe it to be true, and I know it's right. But, he was a little brash. I would encourage a little more humility, but that's basically the point, is that Christians know that everyone reasons in a circle. The goal is to be in the right circle, or to have the right starting point, which for Christians is a God who reveals himself in Scripture, in the world, and ultimately in Jesus. Second problem of this method, it's hard to translate these principles into apologetics for a broad audience. Like every time I've tried to teach a class at my church on apologetics and I start talking about this stuff, people are like, what is he talking about? So I just start talking about assumptions or worldviews. I don't really use the word presupposition because it's a little confusing. But did I confuse you? Does that make sense? Ish. Okay, good. Fourth method, what you might call experiential apologetics. People don't like the word experience sometimes, but I actually find this approach to be maybe the most compelling for people doing gospel ministry in the 21st century. Experiential apologists are trying to interact with unbelievers by helping the unbeliever discover the deep longings of their heart and then inviting the unbeliever to try on the gospel to see how the gospel provides a better answer to those longings than anything in the world could. So it's basically saying, this is your experience, but let me show you how the gospel gives you a true and better end to that story. Or to say it differently, how your life can end happily only in the gospel. How the narrative lines of your life can find a happy ending in Jesus. That's what we mean by experiential apologetics. Let me read. Experiential apologists interact with unbelievers by inviting them to participate in an experience and an embrace of a story that fits better with the actualities of their life. Proofs for the Christian faith rest not in logical deductions or hard evidence, but in the lives of the community of faith and the power of the apostolic message. The gospel story is told and shown, and the unbeliever is asked to try it on for size. So what you're trying to do is show people how the gospel makes better sense and provides better answers to the deep longings of their heart. You might say in some ways that this method is meant to start where someone is. So rather than you saying, let's start with talking about the resurrection, you start by talking about loneliness because a person is feeling lonely. And you meet them there. And you begin your apologetic by beginning where they are. The danger of this method, of course, could be seen to be minimizing the importance of propositional truth, cognitive appeals, as well as underutilization of historical evidences. So the danger would be you so value and overemphasize people's experience that you minimize the fact that Christianity is about proclaimed truth that people need to believe. It isn't just, oh, it makes you feel better, so you should believe it, but God is Lord, and he demands you to bow the knee.